Not at
Hello,
all.
friend. I'm glad that you're here and you're watching this. It's from wherever you are. The Circle of Folk pastors do a lot of face-to-face talking and relating, and there's a lot of questions that come up that we feel are worthy to have some more dialogue. So we're trying this little experiment about exploring questions that someone asked in just 9 minutes. We want to just talk a little bit. So this is unscripted. We came up with the topic yesterday or decided on it, and we're going to see what happens and let it rip. Obviously, there's more to say. Most of these topics are going to be worth a few hours or longer. So thanks for joining in here, and maybe you want to leave some feedback or some comments. But here goes the timer, and today is about whether it is okay to not like Paul. And when we say Paul, Rod, we're talking about the apostle, right? Not just my Uncle Paul.
Yeah, the Apostle Paul wrote most of the New Testament, all those letters. My favorite is Philippians. Well, maybe it's First Corinthians.
My favorite is
But in First
Colossians.
Corinthians, in First Corinthians, he says one of the things that irritate people the most because he has that whole chapter 11 where he's talking about women keeping silent and keeping their head coverings on and all of that. That really makes women in particular feel like Paul just might not be their friend.
Well, do you have to get around that, or how do you address that? Because if somebody reads that and they're just like, well, if you wrote that in a blog tomorrow, somebody's going to tell you or tell me, I don't like Rod, I hear what he just wrote.
Nate, what were you going to say?
Well, I was thinking if you Rod wrote that in a blog tomorrow, my assumption would be that there was a context to your comments. And I think there's a context to Paul's comments that we're always dealing with, not just in First Corinthians, but in all that he writes. He's writing to a particular people, and until we get a hold of what that particular people group was dealing with and talking about, um, it makes some sense to not like Paul if we're just applying it to us ourselves without thinking through that contextual basis.
We really do
I
need
think a
to.
lot of people are reading back in what the church did after, Paul and Jesus lived, and by the year 500, you have women really effectively oppressed by the church. So, it's no doubt that you read back into the Bible and you can see all that oppression getting justified.
Donna, you were going to say something too about the text, maybe?
Yeah, we really ideally would like to read the Bible with first century eyes, if you will, asking 21st century questions. It's a challenge to do that because, oppression is a real thing. And if it seems like Paul is playing into that, people are going to have not just an emotional response, but an ideological problem too. Um, People are
Well, on
often
both
saying,
sides, it's
go ahead,
first
Roger.
century Christianized too. First century Christianized because the Paul and Jesus have women comrades that are right in the middle of their ministry.
Yeah.
That's such a radical thing even for the first century that they wouldn't fit into first century eyes because a lot of people that they were subject to would think that was pretty crazy.
Mm-hmm.
They were very radical in the way that they treated people as humans and not just genders.
Absolutely. I mean, there's a lot of cases of radical inclusion um, on Paul's part too. The passage in 1 Corinthians 11 is actually a way to include women in ministry without having them be further oppressed. You know.
I think another thing that irritates people about Paul is that it looks like his careful arguments are making principles and making laws, because they also breathe back or read back that kind of mentality into what he's saying, where they take his sentences and make them look like they're a rule you're supposed to follow, or you're going to get killed or be on the wrong side of the church. And I think he's doing exactly the opposite. His emphasis on grace and how you actually have this relationship with God that overrides all those previous laws you might follow is so elemental to what he says. that making him actually say the opposite is always just drives me crazy, really.
Mm.
And there's an interesting thing that happens when you compare Paul and Jesus, because Paul's writing for himself and talking to people and developing theology, and the Gospels are written about Jesus. It's not, Jesus first person writing those principles down in a letter or something. And so I think I often face the comparison when someone says that they're having trouble with Paul, but Jesus they're good with. Jesus isn't writing in that first person narrative, and who knows what we would have gotten had he.
If you look at the Paul that Luke writes about in Acts, he is often more generously treated. Just a different perspective. Almost just we write differently than we're written about. That's a good point, Nate.
Rod, one of the things that you taught me over the years was you have to get to know Paul before you just kind of take something that he said and run around with it as a flag for how stupid he was or how backwards people took it. But how does one get to know Paul?
Yeah, I think I was going to say something like that because I regret people missing out on this great Christian. I mean, from my perspective, when I was first becoming a Christian, Paul was very convincing to me. I was the opposite of what having an easy time with Jesus. I had an easier time with Paul because he was so obviously flawed. He was so obviously just a person that was filled with the Holy Spirit that it actually inspired me to think that I could be one. Because I didn't have him on some pedestal or in some saints library or something. I thought he was like writing me a letter. So I could actually see that he was experiencing the things he was talking about and trying to help me figure out how you could humanly engage the Holy Spirit, which I did. I thought, wow, this is amazing. So I didn't. I guess the things I had to sort out just seemed like a natural thing rather than some crisis of, biblical criticism problem or something.
Yeah, I think that.
It's hard to get away from how people have done it, like even in Jesus and the Disenfranchised, Howard Thurman starts telling stories about how his grandmother didn't want her to ever have him ever read Paul to her because the white pastor would use the end of Ephesians and talking about slaves and masters or something and just reinforcing unjust systems. And I think that's right that people have those experiences. They might not.
Yeah, which that particular thing I could never totally figure out because he so clearly says that the slave is God's freedman and the master is God's slave. There's even in that particular social context, which is so obviously oppressive and nasty, which he obviously thinks so. But he redeems it. He manages to have you rise above it because of the grace of God, which I think is brilliant. He really gets it. So trying to make him back into it and say, what are you doing that for?
In that particular letter to the Colossians, he has a corresponding story with Philemon of the way that it might actually work out in terms of justice.
Yeah, brilliant.
Well, we got about a minute left. Anybody you guys each want to take a closing thought? It's 15 seconds long.
I think one of the things I'm sorry, Johnny, go ahead.
One of the ways that I do relate to Paul is by reading him and studying about him. So if you're interested in doing that, this book I recommend. It's called Jesus Have I Loved But Paul, and it's by a Fuller professor who's asking the same kind of question that we are, and he does a really good job of answering it.
And I was going to say beyond that, that more, a deep approach to doing it. I think if you spend a long time in just one of the little books like Philippians and you just like read it every day for a week or something like that, or even longer, you finally do get a feel for what kind of person is behind this letter and what kind of spirit is behind the person. And you manage to get when you're saturated in it, I think you can understand it a little bit better than when you just take little pieces out that might seem like the irritants. It's better as a whole.
Yeah, or if you're going to take little pieces out, my advice would be don't take out the irritants. Take out all of Paul's prayers. They're really helpful to understand his heart.
Well, thank you guys, pastors. I'm grateful for you and your willingness to try something new, a new medium. And to everybody who's watching or listening, thank you. Please like our videos, share them, leave some comments. Maybe you have some questions that you're asking that you want us to talk about, and subscribe. Peace be with you.